Yes, the startling, but I think very positive conclusion of the keys to the White House is that it's governing, not campaigning, that counts. I know that would put a lot of my friends out of business, but it's a very uplifting result for the American people. Now, I came about this by a rather circuitous route. I would love to tell you I came up with my theory and my prediction system by years of brilliant contemplation, by ruining my eyes in the archives. But if I were to tell you that, to quote the late, not so great Richard Nixon, that would be wrong. Came across the keys, at least in part by accident. In 1981, I collaborated with Vladimir Kailas-Borak, the world's leading authority on earthquake prediction from Moscow. We were both distinguished visiting scholars at the time at the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. And my first idea was, being brilliant and foresightful, no, we're not going to collaborate. Earthquakes may be a big deal here in Southern California, but I've got to go back to Washington, D.C., American University. Nobody cares about earthquakes there. And he said, no. I already solved earthquake. You're right. He said, get this. In 1963, he was a member of the Soviet scientific delegation that came to Washington under President John F. Kennedy and negotiated the most important treaty in the history of the world. It's the treaty why young people like you are here. It's the nuclear test ban treaty that kept us from poisoning our atmosphere, our oceans, and our soil. And he said, in Washington, he fell in love with politics. And he always wanted to use the methodology of earthquake prediction to predict elections. But he said, look, I live in the Soviet Union. Elections, forget it. It's supreme leader or off with your head. But you, he said to me, know all about American presidents. So we became the odd couple of political research. And our research was guided by several things. First, by my insight, which wasn't proven yet, that in fact, it was governance, not campaigning, that counts. And I came up with that by my study of the presidential election of all things of 1896, when the Democrats nominated the maverick populist William Jennings Bryan, who went against everything that the incumbent president Grover Cleveland stood for. And he was up against the Republican William McKinley. And Bryan was the great campaigner of his time. He stumped the country. McKinley was stuck in the mud running a front porch campaign from his home. Yet McKinley still beat Bryan because as much as Bryan wanted to distance himself from Cleveland, as much as he out-campaigned McKinley, he was still stuck with the Democratic Depression. The other big insight was to reconceptualize presidential elections in earthquake geophysical terms. That is, not as Carter versus Reagan, remember this is 1981, liberal versus conservative, Republican versus Democrat, but as stability, the White House party keeps the White House, and earthquake, the White House party is turned out of office. So armed with those two insights, we looked at every American presidential election from the horse and buggy days of politics in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected up to the most recent election of 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And that work, using the methodology of pattern recognition from earthquake prediction to see what patterns are associated with stability in earthquake, we came up with our 13 keys to the White House, which gauge the strength and performance of the White House party, and our simple decision rule. You don't even have to take your shoes off to use the keys. 6 or more negative keys, 6 or more keys that go against the White House party, they are predicted losers. Otherwise, they are predicted winners. Voters are smart. They're not tricked. They're not fooled. They're not swindled. They understand what's going on in the country. Voters understood in 2020 the disastrous effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on our economic well-being. They understood the failures of the administration to address the burning issues of racial justice and injustice. And none of the tricks of the campaign, none of the interference really penetrated through that. What does worry me, and apparently that hasn't yet happened, would be if foreign adversaries actually meddled with the voting processes or the voting results. That could just change everything. So far, the voters have triumphed above it, and my keys to the White House have held just as true in 2016 and 2020 as they did in 2008 and 2012. Another value of the keys, by the way, that no other system has, is that they can give you very early predictions, sometimes, not always, because they tell you exactly the factors that influence elections. Other models, like the polls, don't tell you anything about the underlying dynamics of elections, nor do the political science models that look at presidential approval. That could result from anything, but the keys actually outline the specific factors that decide elections, and sometimes those keys fall into place early, not always. For example, in 2006, well over 2 years before the election, I was able to see, based on the keys, that things were going so badly for the Bush administration that I was able to predict a Democratic win in 2008. And same thing when Obama was running for re-election. I saw things were going well enough for Obama that I made my call that he would be reelected. And that was a very tough election to call, as you know. Down to the wire, the polls were showing Romney winning. I made my call in 2010, which caused Nate Silver to write a 20-page attack on the key saying, you can't predict this early. And my response, my own 20-page response, and I'll cut it down to a couple of sentences, was, you can't using polls. They're not of any use, if ever, until right before the election. But I can, because my system outlines the dynamics of the elections. And ultimately, of course, Silver came around in predicting Obama. And I wrote him a very nice email saying, let's do a joint article showing how two different methodologies can come up with the same answer. Never heard from the guy again. He's a publicity hound. He's not one of my favorite people, I have to tell you. And he's just a clerk. All he does is compile polls. That's why he was so horribly wrong in 2016 and 2020. Correct. Democrats would love to say it's our great candidate, it's our wonderful issues that carried the day. Well, they had those same issues, 4 years ago, and they still lost. It's governance, not campaigning, that counts, as much as that may bruise the ego of candidates and political operatives. A very close friend of mine, known him for over 50 years, is Robert Shrum. You may not have heard of him, but until recently, he was the leading Democratic consultant, ran a number of presidential campaigns. And when I first came up with the keys back in 1981, I gave them to Robert Shrum. And he calls me back a few days later and he said, Lichtman, I hate the keys. Find your crazy Russian friend again and redo them and come up with something I can manipulate. The keys are not manipulable. They're governance. They're not campaigning. Much as I love Robert Shrum, you're not responsible for losses, and you don't get the credit for the wins. If there was one word I would eliminate, well, it's a couple of them, but among the words I would eliminate from political discussion is electability. That is the most misleading concept, because the keys show, unless you're a John F. Kennedy or a Franklin Roosevelt or Ronald Reagan, the candidate comes around, once in a generation, the candidate doesn't matter. There's no such thing as electability. Biden, the moderate, wins, right? So the convention was, you need to be moderate. Well, Clinton, the moderate, lost. Kerry, the moderate, lost. Al Gore, the moderate, lost. generals and politicians are always fighting the last war. And if I'm right, what I always tell voters is vote for who you believe in. Never, ever vote on electability, because that's a trap. That's a chimera that you shouldn't be following. The keys are very counterintuitive. And when I first came up with them, they were widely rejected. But after a while, when they worked for a number of years, the professional forecasting world embraced them. Took close to 20 years, but they did embrace them. And I twice keynoted the International Summit of Forecasting. I published in all the big forecasting journals. They had a special edition of one of the journals devoted to the keys. I constantly speak about the keys. You know, they are discussed worldwide in the media and in the scholarly literature. So they are now very well, but they are counterintuitive. And, you know, they really put out of business a lot of my good friends in the consulting and the polling business. I like to say, I have nothing against these folks. They're friends of mine. They do their jobs well. But what I'd love to see is every 4 years, all of them sent off on a very wonderful vacation on some faraway Pacific island. At presidential level doesn't mean it's the wrong
presidential level.
You know, one of the interesting things you put, well, you know, Biden appealed to all these suburban voters. Well, if that's true, why did the Democrats take such a pasting in suburban districts in the House? Presidential elections and other messages, the keys are unique. They're unlike any other type of election. And one of the problems with the conventional wisdom is it doesn't recognize that, the special dynamics of a presidential election. You know, which is why, you know, Ronald Reagan or Dwight Eisenhower or Richard Nixon could win these huge landslides, 60% of the vote, and not take back the houses of Congress. Also, it's a hard key to achieve, but actually polarized politics makes it easier, as we've seen with Biden. You know, everything that Trump did, he's overturned. So he's already achieved the policy change key, overturning so many executive orders on the environment, on immigration, passing with not a single Republican vote this $1.9 trillion bill. I'm going to give you a big secret. Everyone's talking about Biden being a one-term president. The guy's even older than me, and I'm as old as dust, you know. However, if the Democrats want to win again in 2024, the keys say their best bet is to renominate Biden. Again, totally counterintuitive, as the keys always are. But here's why. One of the keys is incumbency. You win the incumbency, you lose it otherwise. Another key is internal party battle. It's not going to be a big internal party battle against a sitting president, but if Biden doesn't run, Kamala Harris is not just going to walk into the nomination. There's going to be a big battle. I'm certainly concerned about it. Do I think it will change the keys? No. But I think it, you know, it's much more likely to affect other elections. A lot of House elections decided by, you know, anywhere from 6 votes in one case to hundreds or a few thousands in other cases. And so I am very much worried about voter suppression affecting all elections but presidential elections, which I think the tides are probably too big. Although, you know, we'll have to see just how devastating this voter suppression is. Now, let me again give you something on the bright side. There is a flip side to voter suppression, and that is it does spark a backlash. That is, minority leaders like Stacey Abrams, Senator Warnock, do use voter suppression to actually get out the minority vote. They're trying to stop you from voting, and we're not going to let that happen. So there is a backlash to it.